Hello and welcome to this week's installment of Movie Breakdowns. I have with me the lead psychology professor at UW-Madison and the professor of Greek literary history at UW-Madison. Today we're going to be discussing The Truman Show. The Truman Show is a movie directed by Peter Weir starring Jim Carrey as Truman. The movie is about a TV show that's been created to revolve around Truman, but Truman is completely unaware of it. Basically, Truman's surrounded by a giant bubble, completely isolated from the rest of the world. Christof is the creator of this fake world and the director of the TV show. We're going to play an audio clip for you now. In this clip, Christof is being interviewed about Truman, and Truman has just discovered that his world isn't actually real. Christof makes an assertion regarding to why it took so long for Truman to realize that, and we're going to look into this a little bit today. So let's take a look.
Christof, let me ask you, why do you think that Truman has never come close to discovering the true nature of his world until now?
We accept the reality of the world with which we're presented. It's as simple as that.
As a professor of abnormal psychology, I can provide a unique lens on Truman's position within his world. I'm able to put Truman's life until his true discovery of this world into a context that is centered around Truman's battle against his mind, the battle whether to listen to his inclination of a false reality or accept his presented world. Christof is basically telling us as the audience that Truman has lasted so long within this manufactured world because he accepted the only option for reality he was given. Truman thought it was normal when his wife described products she bought at the grocery store similarly to an infomercial. It has taken Truman close to 30 years to realize his whole world wasn't normal because he wasn't presented with anything different than his fake life that he was offered. Every single product was advertised and every single word spoken to Truman was scripted. Essentially, Truman wasn't aware of his manufactured life because it was the only life he knew.
Well said, Professor. That whole Truman Show concept is something both intriguing and terrifying at the same time. But this sort of psychological idea is hardly a new one. In fact, as far as we can tell, it has been a hot topic of discussion for thousands of years. As a professor in the field of Greek literary and philosophical history, let me tell you of the famous philosopher Plato, who dedicated an entire work in his section, The Republic, to explaining and exploring this idea. He uses the example of a group of prisoners in a cave, chained and shackled, only being able to see the stone cavern wall in front of them. And from behind them lies a fire, along with some puppeteers who create shadows that are cast onto the wall the prisoners can see. The interesting part is that these prisoners think what they see is the reality of the world. When the puppeteers hold a book in front of the fire, the prisoners see only the shadow of the book cast onto the wall, but in their segregated reality determine that the shadow is the book. There is no physical book with leather bindings or wrinkled pages and whatnot. There is only a shadow of a sort of square object, which is completely and ultimately a book to the prisoners. Are they wrong? Yes, but is it a fault of theirs? Or is it just a symptom of what Christof's idea that people will accept the reality of which they are presented, whether or not it be the truth?
Okay, so Plato's cave was, the first well-documented reference to the idea that perceived reality could be different than what we think. Plato takes it a different route and also talks about what happens once the prisoner realizes he's been watching shadows his entire life. Mr. Phelps, do you want to elaborate on what Plato is basically trying to say by this?
Sure. So later in his writing, Plato goes into detail as to what might happen if one of the prisoners was to get free from his shackles and be able to emerge from the cave. First, Plato writes, he would feel blindness and rage. He's being taken from the entire life he knew, and even more so, being forced to look at the blinding light of the sun, which hurts the prisoner even further. This new world he's discovering seems infinitely more distant and unknown than the familiar world he once knew. But eventually, the prisoner would get used to the light. He'd be able to see the world clearly and start to understand the way nature and the sun all work into this world. But, Plato writes, what does the prisoner think of those still trapped in the cave? He would feel lucky for the knowledge that he gained, but also feel sorry for those who haven't seen the light. But if he were to go back in the cave, he would be ridiculed by the other prisoners. The free man has lost his adjustment to the darkness that he once had, so in the eyes of the prisoners, his emergence into the sun did nothing but hurt him. And finally, he ends with saying that if one were to attempt to forcefully bring the prisoners up to the true surface they believe only causes harm, it is likely that they would do anything in their power to stop them, even, as Plato writes, taking his life.
Plato mentions that when the prisoners are released from their bonds, they are astonished and at times unwilling to accept their own reality. This also happens with those that suffer from the Truman Show delusion. They are unwilling to accept reality after they are told that they are not in a television show. Instead, they lead a normal life unintruded. When the prisoners see a book for the first time, they fail to accept that the object that they are holding, can touch, and can feel is a book. The prisoners are unwilling to accept reality. Instead, they are confused because what they know as a book is the shadow that a book casts when held in the light. This is also the case with people who suffer from schizophrenia and have the Truman Show delusion.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this the Truman Show delusion. So I understand that it relates to this movie, not too hard to get from the name. Joel Gold, a psychologist at New York's Bellevue Hospital, says the Truman Show delusion encompasses a patient's entire life. They believe their family, friends, and coworkers are all reading from scripts, and their home, workplace, and hospital are all sets. They believe that their entire life is being filmed for the whole world to see. Gold initially treated 5 white male patients with middle-class upbringing and education, all who thought they were actors on reality TV shows. 3 specifically referenced the movie The Truman Show, giving rise to the disorder's name. The catch, however, is that in all 5 of these cases, the patients said this concern was realized after reading or watching something about The Truman Show or other references to the idea that our perceived reality is not true reality. Gold first saw these symptoms in 2002, 4 years after The Truman Show came out. What this tells us about human psychology is that without being exposed to this idea, people won't really question their reality. People will accept it just as Truman did. And that's what Christoph is really trying to get at when he says this. It's the idea that people simply accept whatever reality they perceive, that perception being based on what an individual person observes on a daily basis. So let's hear from our professor of abnormal psychology, Jake Sankey, on the specific case study.
Patients who suffer from the Truman Show delusion have accepted their reality as a television show. One case study done by Gold, as previously mentioned by Nate here, talks of a man who suffers from paranoid schizophrenia and suffers from the Truman Show delusion. When admitted to a psychiatric hospital, he repeatedly asked the orderlies to see the director and believed that the Twin Towers never fell on 9/11. This man even traveled to New York to find the towers to be gone because they actually did fall on 9/11. Still, this man failed to accept his reality and continued to believe he was on a television show. Though Truman was ultimately correct in his growing suspicion about his own world, many people have suspicions about our own world, and they accept the world that their hallucinations, primarily coming through schizophrenia, present them with.
Well, that was very insightful. We definitely looked into what Christoph was really trying to say. People do tend to accept their reality until presented with this idea, of course, which can provoke some very serious mental illness for those who take it to the next level. The Truman Show is one of my personal favorites. I'm glad we were able to look into it a little bit. Well, thanks for being on the show, gentlemen. Don't forget to tune in next week when I'll be interviewing Daniel Tosh about his upcoming presidential campaign.
In case I don't see ya. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night.